Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Boise City Department of Arts and History's Fettuccine Forum. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Travis Jeffries, and I am the History Programs Manager for the Department of Arts and History. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the ancestral, cultural, traditional, and unceded territory of the Shoshone, Bannock, and Northern Paiute people in the Boise Valley. We're excited to bring you a special program tonight, a virtual talk and presentation by Dr. Bradley Snow of Montana State University entitled Idaho's Coeur d'Alenes and the Promise and Perils of Industrial Modernity on a Western Resource Frontier. Before I introduce our guest, I'd like to go over just a few housekeeping items. I'd like to gently remind everyone that tonight's program is being recorded, and we'll make sure that recording is available online in the next few weeks for your continued viewing pleasure. And of course, we encourage you to share that with your friends as well. Perhaps most importantly, it's called the Fettuccine Forum for a reason. We see this as a dialogue, and so we encourage audience participation. Please send your questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A feature. We're going to hold off on answering those questions until the end of the presentation, but you don't need to wait until the end of the presentation to pose questions. As soon as you think of one, feel free to type it in, again, using that Q&A feature. And we'll do our best to get to as many of your questions as we can during the Q&A portion, again, at the end of the presentation. So I'll take a moment to enable auto transcription. And then everybody should be able to see, by clicking the live transcript button, you'll be able to see captions at the bottom of your screen. You'll have to click the live transcript button and then select show subtitles. Our American Sign Language interpreter this evening is Lavona Andrew. Thank you so much, Lavona, for joining us tonight and providing this important service. So the Fettuccine Forum has been a fixture of the Boise cultural landscape for a long time. So I'd like to provide just a little bit of background on it. The forum has a fun name, which recalls the origins of the event. It dates back to 1989, when Boise State University's College of Social Science and Public Affairs began a lunchtime lecture series at Noodles, a popular Italian restaurant at the time. Pat Beater, former Mayor David Beater's father, was one of the early founders, along with his friend Pug Ostling. In 2003, the forum was relaunched by former Mayor Beater with support from the Department of History at Boise State University as a first Thursday event produced by the Office of the City Historian. In 2008, the newly formed Department of Arts and History took over the role. The Fettuccine Forum remains a lively and informal gathering, which invites the public to interact with politicians, artists, historians, activists, advocates, and professionals in an effort to promote good citizenship and responsible growth through education. The forum is possible with support from the Office of the Mayor, Boise State Public Radio, the Department of History at Boise State University, and all of you. And if you like programming like the forum, please consider a small donation to the History Division's Heritage Fund. Everything really does help. And remember, funding the Fettuccine Forum feeds your brain. For more information, please visit boiseartsandhistory.org. This year's Fettuccine Forum series runs from February through April and is organized around climate change and environmental history in Idaho and the West. The city of Boise is committed to taking action to address climate change and be carbon neutral by 2050. To get there, we invite you to learn more about the Boise City's Climate Action Roadmap at cityofboise.org/climate. I now have the distinct pleasure of introducing our speaker tonight, Dr. Bradley Snow. Dr. Snow is an American historian. He received a PhD in history from Montana State University-Bozeman in 2012. His areas of concentration are environmental history and the history of the American West. He works as a teaching professor in Montana State's Department of History and Philosophy. His book on the Coeur d'Alenes, Living with Lead, An Environmental History of Idaho's Coeur d'Alenes 1885 to 2011, was published by the University of Pittsburgh Press in 2017. And I'm now pleased to turn our time over to him.
Thanks very much, Travis. Very nice.
You're looks like, nope, never mind. I thought you might have been muted, but you're all good. So
okay. Well, hopefully everybody can hear me. Thanks for that very nice introduction, Travis, and it's been great working with you. I'll just jump into it. The Coeur d'Alene's mining district has been an incredibly productive district. By the end of the 20th century, the Coeur d'Alene's had issued forth more than $45.54 billion in 2022 dollars in metals since the discovery of gold on Pritchard Creek in 1883. Just for a little bit of perspective on that, more than 34,300 metric tons of silver, 870,000 metric tons of zinc, and 288,000 metric tons of lead had come out of the Coeur d'Alene's by the end of the 20th century, or 18% of the national production of silver, which ranks it first in the production of silver in the US, 17% of the production of the nation's zinc, and 6% of the production of the nation's lead. And in those latter two categories, the Coeur d'Alene's mining district placed third in national production. This all really kind of got started when the world rushed in to this corner of the Idaho Panhandle, beginning in the fall of 1883 with Andrew Pritchard's discovery of gold on Pritchard Creek. The nascent Northern Pacific Railroad heavily promoted Pritchard's gold strike and put out a pamphlet on it, which sparked a gold rush in the winter of 1883-84. The Northern Pacific line ran to Belknap, Montana, and then thousands of would-be prospectors trudged over the mountains through the snow to get to Pritchard Creek in that winter. By the late summer of 1884, Murrayville, later known as Murray, Idaho, founded in January of 1884, boasted a population of 2,500. More than $500,000 in gold was taken from thereabouts, but small-scale placer miners in 1884-85. But the Coeur d'Alene's future really lay in other metals and in quartz mining. So now we get to Noah Kellogg and the discovery either by him or his jackass, depending on whom you believe. In September of 1885, Kellogg was mining around Murray and decided he wanted to go prospect around the South Fork of the Coeur d'Alene River, about 35 miles distant. Kellogg was kind of a somewhat hard luck, grizzled, middle-aged miner. He was grub-staked by some local merchants and trudged the miles over to this, the South Fork of the Coeur d'Alene River. Didn't discover anything over the course of a few days, at least according to legend. Didn't discover anything. Decided to take a nap before giving up and starting back for Pritchard. But upon waking up, he found that he couldn't find his donkey, his jackass, and set out after the animal. And when he found the jackass was, at least according to legend, standing on a very rich outcropping of silver lead galena. And to this day, they still honor jackasses in the Silver Valley. And that was essentially the basis for the then silver, lead, zinc rush into what became known as the Coeur d'Alene's and then later the Silver Valley. Unlike placer mining, silver lead mining it requires intensive quartz mining, which requires a lot of capital and technology. So pretty quickly, you got major US capitalists investing in the mining district. People such as Simeon Reed, a steel and railroad magnate from Portland, William H. Crocker and D.O. Mills, bankers and financiers from San Francisco, James Houteling from Chicago, and Ed Ryerson, a steel magnate from Chicago, all ended up funding what became the largest mining and smelting concern in the Coeur d'Alenes, the Bunker Hill Company, which was founded in 1889. Also, world famous mining engineer John Hayes Hammond was involved in that effort. Originally, the Bunker Hill Company had the very long title of the Bunker Hill and Sullivan Mining and Concentrating Company. And just a few miles up the road, the Guggenheims had their Federal Mining and Smelting Corporation up around Wallace. Whereas Bunker Hill was at first headquartered, was first centered in Wardner, and then later it was centered down in Kellogg, Idaho. Although it was, its corporate headquarters were in Portland, initially in Portland, Oregon. Labor, of course, rushed into the valley as well, and looking for jobs in the mines, and then later in the mills and concentrators, and then after that in the Bunker Hills lead smelter and zinc plant. By 1890, Shoshone County's population was 5,179, whereas it had just been a few hundred people, under 500 in 1880. By 1900, it was nearly 12,000, of whom 3,149, or more than a quarter, were foreign born. And there were significant populations from English Canada, Sweden, Germany, England, Ireland, and Italy. So it was a polyglot population in the area. In the blink of an eye, late 19th century industrial modernity had arrived in a 10 by 25 mile section of the Idaho Panhandle. And by the end of 1890, 2 railroad lines served the narrow mining district. Mills and concentrators were popping up like mushrooms after a spring rain. In all, 18 area mines have yielded over 1 million pounds of metal over the course of the history of the district. And this is all part of the larger late 19th century process of the incorporation of America, as the scholar Alan Trachtenberg has labeled it, and of the capture and feeding of Western natural resources, such as the minerals of the Coeur d'Alenes, into the national sort of capitalist industrial maw of primarily the large interests that were growing up at this time, as you see U.S. Carnegie Steel, and then later U.S. Steel, and a whole bunch of other big corporations rising up for the first time in American history. And you may be wondering about this slide. It's clearly from the late 19th century in Wardner, which sits just above Kellogg, Idaho. And this relates to the legend of Noah and his jackass. This is, from what I understand, this is reputed to be, at least in legend, Noah's jackass that the kids are getting a free ride on here in Wardner. And speaking of those mills that were popping up so quickly in the Coeur d'Alenes in the late 19th and early 20th century, here we see some mills. I believe these are south of Kellogg, and you also see some railroad tracks. And this would have been a fairly typical scene in the Coeur d'Alenes mining district in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Where you had a vibrant string of working class communities develop during this era. Communities such as Mullen, which is near Lookout Pass, just a few miles west of the Montana-Idaho border. Wallace, which is maybe about 9 miles west of Mullen and downhill, down the mountains from Mullen. Burke, Osborne, Wardner, Kellogg, Smelterville, which was created later in 1917 after the Bunker Hill Company built its lead plant, and Kingston are some of those communities. So an aspect of this vibrant early mining community was, as some of you may know, a lot of labor strife. The area really became known and to some extent infamous for its violent labor strife in the 1890s and very early 1900s. The violence included dynamiting, pitched battles, Pinkerton detectives working for the mine owners, and eventually the assassination of a pro-management former Idaho governor, Frank Steunenberg. The Bunker Hill Company, as the largest corporate outfit in the district, decided that it needed to do something following all of this labor violence to try to create a more quiescent workforce. And it wanted to court employee goodwill, while at the same time being a fiercely anti-union company that did everything it could to keep unionists out of its employ. And in the process of becoming a rather paternalistic company, especially in the city of Kellogg, Bunker Hill became known locally as Uncle Bunker. Maybe I'll switch to another. Oh, here's a map that shows the area. This is a Forest Service map from the 1950s. And this shows some of the local geography. You see Kellogg on my right. This, of course, is the Interstate 90 running through it. Smelterville is kind of toward my left, toward the top of the map. Wardner would be up here. And you've got the zinc plant is number 4. The smelter is number 3. The mine entrance is right near Uptown Kellogg. And here's the mine entrance is number 2 to the Bunker Hill mine. And here's the other entrance to the mine is number 1, and that's up in Wardner. So Bunker Hill decided to try to engage in a lot of, I guess, what you might call corporate paternalism, particularly focused on the community of Kellogg, which by the teens was rapidly becoming the largest city in the Coeur d'Alenes. Just to give you some idea of the demographic growth of the area, and of Kellogg, by 1910, Kellogg had 1,552 people. It reached its population apex in 1957 with 5,900 people approximately. But by 1980, it was down to 3,417. And then with the shutdown of Bunker Hill in 1982, it declined rapidly. The estimated population in 2019 was 2,390 people. Shoshone County's population zenith was in 1950 when it reached a population of nearly 23,000 people. In 2020, its estimated population was a little under 13,000. But back to Uncle Bunker. It created a company union, a fairly malleable and quiescent union, not really an independent bargaining agent. And then it incentivized workers joining that union. It was called the Wardner Industrial Union. And it also, Bunker Hill created an industrial YMCA, which it built a 3-story red brick building in Uptown Kellogg, and then put all sorts of facilities in there. It offered a floor to the Wardner Industrial Union. It put a swimming pool in. There were bowling alleys. Eventually, there was a night school that the company ran there. And the company offered all kinds of largesse to the industrial YMCA and to the community of Kellogg more generally. It built ball fields for the YMCA, actually very nice ball fields that are still in use to this day in Kellogg. Promoted the Boy Scouts and would give workers up to a free week off to go lead scouting troops. Offered free mortgages to employees and helped them buy housing. Had a free ski school from the late 1950s on for local kids. It paid the YMCA director's salary directly. And also, as a part of the YMCA, offered reading and library facilities. So the YMCA was something that the community really took part in and was very proud of, as was Bunker Hill. The community also, or the Bunker Hill also offered, paid for water and power for decades to Wardner and Kellogg. Built the first school, the first 2 hospitals in town. And I think you get the idea. It was just, there was a lot of corporate beneficence there from Bunker Hill, which was not purely altruistic. It was designed really to keep the locals happy and to keep the sort of union strife and independent unionism that Bunker Hill had seen in the 1890s. They wanted to keep that from rearing its head again. Another thing that the company supported was the miners' picnics, which were typically 4-day events held in the summer in Kellogg. And these were a big deal. In 1937, for example, the miners' picnic attracted 10,000 people. There would be parades, plays would be put on, there'd be boxing matches, baseball games, maybe an air show, speeches. The top politicians in the state, including in the 1920s and 30s, William Borah, the Lion of Idaho, would come and speak at the miners' picnics. And Bunker Hill would substantially help to fund those picnics, which technically were put on by the company union, the Wardner Industrial Union. Bunker Hill also had an outsized economic impact on the community, and particularly on Kellogg, but also on Shoshone County. It was the second largest employer in Idaho for many decades. And between 1942 and 81, Bunker Hill annually employed between 1,233 and 3,151 workers and paid between $3.3 million and $50 million in payroll. In 1975, when the company's property taxes were about $1.36 million, that represented 22% of Shoshone County's tax revenue and 51% of Kellogg's. Unhappily for the company, but perhaps happily for many of the workers, real unions emerged in the Coeur d'Alenes and at Bunker Hill in early World War I, or World War II, during 1941 and 42. The New Deal and the advent of World War II proved a boon to union organizers in the Coeur d'Alenes. And in December of 1941, Bunker Hill signed a contract with the zinc plant workers, who in October had joined the International Union of Mine, Mill, and Smelter Workers, or Mine Mill. In May of 42, the company also recognized the lead smelter and mine workers, who had also joined Mine Mill. And the company would be a closed shop with not infrequent strikes and often difficult contract negotiations with the union for the rest of its 4 decades of existence. This image that we're looking at here which says each a perfect product. It was undated, but I would guess it's from the 1930s or perhaps the 40s. This appears to be a Bunker Hill float in a parade. I'm guessing probably in Kellogg. And you see each local beauty is representing a metal produced by the Bunker Hill Company. So zinc, lead, and silver, respectively, there. We need to talk probably a little bit about the nature of lead, which plays an important role in this story. Lead has been in use since at least 4000 BC and was a key component of ancient Roman civilization. And it's been recognized as a potent toxin to humans since at least the 2nd century BCE. It's particularly harmful to children because with their growing bodies, they absorb it very rapidly. And it's a potent neurotoxin that's associated with mental retardation, IQ loss, nerve damage, kidney damage, hypertension, and a host of other maladies. But it also saw widespread use in industrial civilization for a long time. Now it's mostly just used in the making of storage batteries. But for many decades, it was used in the production of tetraethyl lead or leaded gasoline, in leaded paint, undersea cables, X-ray shields, bullets, still used in bullets, and in lead pipes and solder. And it's known within the industry as the useful metal. The lead health science has shifted over the years. It was once thought that there were safe levels of lead that could be in the human body. That's not now considered to be true. There are no safe levels of lead. The CDC has dropped the threshold of concern for kids from 30 to 25 milligrams per deciliter of blood lead. It dropped it that way in 1985, and then down to 10 milligrams per deciliter in 1991. The threshold of concern is now 3.5 milligrams per deciliter. This is a picture of Bunker Hill workers in the paycheck line in the late 1950s. And here's some lead bullion, lead ingots. I just went on the web and found those today. So we're still producing lead. China produces a lot of lead now. So we can't really talk about the Coeur d'Alenes, unfortunately, without talking about pollution. All that lead that was being mined and smelted had to go somewhere. And a lot of it ended up going down the waterways of the area. Here we're looking at an EPA map, I think from around 2010, that shows the watershed. This is the South Fork of the Coeur d'Alene that my cursor is on. Here's Kellogg. This is the mining district up in here. And tailings from all those mills that were built in the Coeur d'Alenes, tailings would wash down, and they washed down at least as far as Spokane, down through Lake Coeur d'Alene and down into the Spokane River and down to Spokane, which is about 80 miles from the heart of the mining district. And this map shows where concentrations of lead are significant. The darker colors show where, according to EPA, they're at least 2,000 parts of lead per million parts of soil, which is twice as high as the cleanup levels that were sought by the EPA. By the end of the 20th century, on the order of 56 million metric tons of tailings, the off product of milling ores, had washed downstream from the district. Until about 1925, most of these were jig tailings, sand-sized particles that mostly accumulated upstream, forming tailings bars. But thereafter, most were slimes, fine-grained particles that traveled much further downstream. And the change owed to a technological shift by mill operators from the jig table method to the flotation process of concentrating ores, which increased recovery rates to as much as 90% from about 60 to 80%. But unfortunately, flotation produced much smaller tailings particles that would wash much further. This whole area is very prone to flooding. And when it floods, the tailings would tend to wash out over the land around the river and settle there, which if you were a downstream farmer or rancher, could cause you significant problems. As early as 1899, those downstream farmers and ranchers were already complaining. A rancher named Hill was the first one to file suit in 1903. Hill won. He was a rare plaintiff to win one of these cases. He won at the state Supreme Court, but was only awarded the cost of his appeal. But generally, the mining corporations had their trials in federal court, and they usually won, in part because the federal courts considered the economic impact of mining in the area, which was so preponderant that was factored in, and they generally won these lawsuits against downstream farmers and ranchers. Nonetheless, the mining owners were getting concerned. By 1901, they had formed the Mine Owners Association, or MOA, and after they did suffer one significant loss in the Polak case in 1919. And Polak was a downstream rancher who was around Cataldo, who was awarded $3,500. And that judgment probably sped up the process that the MOA already had going since 1910 of basically what I call purchasing the problem, where they started buying pollution easements on downstream land, basically the right to pollute that land. And they also bought a lot of land outright downstream. They eventually, by the late 1930s, the MOA had bought 26,000 acres of downstream land. And essentially, that solved their legal problem, at least until the kind of new era of environmental regulations in the 1960s and 70s came into being. Nonetheless, downstream interests were still concerned, including by the late 1920s, a growing group in the city of Coeur d'Alene, whose economic interests in timber and tourism did not match those of the upstream mining communities. And a newspaper editor with the Coeur d'Alene Press named John Knox Coe began really crusading on the issue of upstream pollution and what it was doing to Lake Coeur d'Alene and the lower Coeur d'Alene River, pointing to instances of dead waterfowl and dead fish. His paper published a lengthy series on the issue of water pollution and agitated for an end to the pollution of the lower river and the lake. That resulted in a river and basin commission that the legislature established in 1931 to study the problem of pollution, of water pollution. And Dr. M.M. Ellis, the head of fisheries investigations with the Federal Bureau of Fisheries, got in and studied the river extensively, studied the South Fork and the main stem of the Coeur d'Alene rivers, and concluded that a 50-mile long section, essentially from just upstream of Wallace all the way down to Lake Coeur d'Alene, was what he called a dead river, that basically was devoid of fish fauna, bottom fauna, and plankton organisms. And he blamed mine wastes, upstream mine wastes, for the state of the rivers. Ellis recommended the creation of settling ponds upstream by the big mining companies. Settling ponds like the ones he had seen in use at the Sullivan mines in Kimberley, British Columbia. But the mining companies were resistant, and the River and Basin Commission did not end up recommending those in its final report. We do begin to see changes, though, around 1968, when there was sort of a new environmental mood in the air. In the late 60s and early 70s, there were a lot of environmental changes happening, both in Idaho and nationally. And the big mining corporations in the district finally decided to follow Ellis's recommendation. And they built settling ponds and tailing impoundments up in the district, which began to lead to significant water quality improvement in the area. Also in 1970, the creation of the EPA, and in 1972, the passage of the Clean Water Act led Bunker Hill and the other mining companies to have to spend significant sums of money to clean up their tailings operations. You begin to see some recovery in the local rivers by the early 1970s. Fishermen by the early 70s were catching bullhead, tench, perch, and squawfish at Springston, which is just upstream from Lake Coeur d'Alene. And by the early 90s, there were reports of fish in the lower South Fork of the Coeur d'Alene. But I still wouldn't recommend that you eat a lot of fish from there, or from the South Fork, or from the main stem of the Coeur d'Alene, or even from Lake Coeur d'Alene. The Kellogg Smelterville stretch of the South Fork is nearly devoid of macroinvertebrates or fish food, and there are no bull trout in the South Fork, and there are no West Slope cutthroat, or West Slope cutthroat are rarely found above Smelterville, except way up in the mountains above Mullen. Mine wastes, of course, are found as far down as the beaches of the Spokane River. An estimated 350,000 to 444,000 tons of lead coat the floor of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Countless fish, frogs, and plants were killed. Hundreds of horses and thousands of ducks and geese also have been killed by the mine pollution. And by 2001, it was estimated that if the district's tailings were set in a football field, they would be 4 miles tall. In 2002, EPA expanded the Superfund site that had been 21 square miles and centered on Kellogg to include all 1,500 square miles of the Coeur d'Alene Basin, and projected that it would take 50 to 90 years to clean at a cost of $1.3 billion. And here you see the river This is where the South Fork bleeds into the North Fork of the Coeur d'Alene River. The top picture shows the river running in 1968, before the settling ponds were created. And you see it runs very white or gray into the North Fork up here. This is the South Fork running in. Here in this lower picture, after the tailing ponds had been set up, you see it's running a lot cleaner than it had been in the previous picture. And this is the South Fork. Well, not today. This is a picture that I took 12 years ago. But this is the South Fork of the Coeur d'Alene relatively recently, far cleaner than it used to be. Here's the lead smelter. The Bunker Hill built its own lead smelter in 1916-17. Here it is in October of 1917, with just almost gleaming new at that time. And here's the smelter plant a few years later in 1924. The Bunker Hill decided to build its own lead smelter in Kellogg, in part because it felt that it had a fairly quiescent and dependent population that wouldn't complain too much. Also, it cut a deal with the Forest Service pretty quickly. The company got the Forest Service to agree that in return for not launching lawsuits against the company, the company would fix any damage to the forest that its smelter caused. The company also built a zinc plant. We'll stay there. The company also built a zinc plant in 1928 to process its quantities of zinc. The company, Bunker Hill, very early on realized that it was going to have a problem with smelter pollution. And so it decided to essentially adopt a similar strategy to what it had adopted with the MOA for water pollution. Essentially, it tried to buy the problem again. And it would buy out landowners whom it felt were in the path of the smelter smoke. And so it paid out quite a bit of money locally over that. Either would buy the land directly or would buy a pollution easement from a local. The company realized that there might be a potential problem with lead pollution and human health. It realized that could be a problem when ASARCO had to pay out the local community for health damage to children in 1972. And unfortunately for the company, it repeated what had happened in El Paso, but on a much bigger scale, which led to the infamous lead health epidemic of 1973 through 75 in the Kellogg area. This picture shows parents and kids lined up for CDC blood tests in August of 1974. Essentially what happened was the company was running its lead smelter when there was a fire in the bag house in September of 1973. And it probably the prudent thing to have done would have been to shut down until it could run its bag house, which was the chief filtration system. But instead, the company continued to run the lead smelter full bore for the next 6 months, creating a massive public health problem in the area and spiking kids' blood leads to pretty much unheard of levels. And the price of lead was high at the time of the baghouse fire and rising. So there were incentives for the company to keep the lead smelter running. And unfortunately, it did just that. And it poisoned the community. The medical authorities and public health authorities began to get wind of this in April of 1974, get wind of the problem. And once they began to look at it, they discovered that there were some of the worst sort of public health lead problems ever recorded. The median blood lead level within 1 mile of the smelter was 68.3 milligrams per deciliter in the 172 kids that were tested there. And just to put that in perspective, 40, you were supposed to take kids to the hospital at 40 milligrams per deciliter back in that era. And now you would take kids to the hospital at probably at 20 milligrams per deciliter. Philip Landrigan, the chief CDC investigator, called this the worst public lead health public health crisis in the nation's history. And measures of lead in the soil, air, on homegrown vegetables, et cetera, were the highest ever recorded in North America. And sadly, a number of health problems have been detected in the kids who lived closest to the smelter during this incident. There was a federal study done in 1996 of the kids who had lived through this versus a control group of kids from Spokane, and that showed proof of long-term harm. The kids who lived near the lead smelter scored worse than the cohort from Spokane on nerve conduct, hand-eye coordination, grip strength, nerve sensitivity, and vocabulary. And they all had significantly higher rates of infertility, learning disabilities, sleep disorders, blood pressure, anemia, arthritis, depression, anxiety, memory loss, and trouble concentrating. So there's a lot of evidence of long-term harm to the unfortunate kids who suffered through the baghouse fire incident in the Kellogg area. And they found proof of harm earlier than 1996 as well. The Shoshone Lead Health Project came right in the wake of the whole incident, found evidence of slowed nerve conduction, velocity, and anemia in the kids who lived close by. I see Travis.
Oh yeah, I popped back in just as a gentle reminder that we have about 10 minutes remaining in tonight's program. So
I will quickly wrap up.
Sounds good, and then we'll move to some questions.
Here's a picture of what the landscape looked like in the late 70s or early 80s. That's the lead smelter in the foreground, the zinc plant in the background. You see a rather denuded landscape. That's largely from the high sulfur content from the zinc plant. Just to quickly conclude, Kellogg is a lot cleaner now. Kellogg and the Silver Valley is a lot cleaner now, but it doesn't have the sort of the vibrant working class culture that it once did. Kellogg's basically become a ski town, and the jobs there pay, maybe around a sixth of what the mining jobs used to pay. They got this nifty 3.1 mile long gondola, thanks to an appropriation that was secured by Senator James McClure. But there are a lot of trade-offs when you look at the Silver Valley. It's become a big, super fun cleanup site. Kellogg has become a tourist-based amenity. town, but it's significantly depopulated from where it was in 1980. And it lacks the vibrant working class culture that it had at that time. This is a picture from the base of the ski hill, which is now used to be called Jackass Bowl. It's now called Silver Mountain. And this is the now boarded up old YMCA building. It's not the pride of Kellogg the way it once was. So I'll wrap up there. Sorry, I ran on too long. I could obviously talk about the Silver Valley all day. So I'll wrap up and maybe take some questions.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks so much, Dr. Snow, for a very enjoyable presentation. And I really learned a lot from your presentation, but also from reading your book. And there was just a couple of things that you touched on. And there's a couple of questions from the audience that I want to get to as well. But I was also curious, I mean, you mentioned a couple of times this term industrial modernity, and I was wondering if you could just explain, not only what industrial modernity means, right, but are we still in a phase of industrial modernity? Have we transitioned away from that? And then I kind of have a follow-up question about that too, as far as where does the majority of mining take place, in the world today? Because I think that the two are kind of related. But maybe we could start with tackling that first one. What is industrial modernity?
Yeah, it's basically the world that was brought in by the Industrial Revolution and by the rise of big corporations. And it's the world of cities and high tech. And back in the late 1800s, that meant railroads and mining towns like Kellogg. And by the 1950s, it meant something different. But some say that we're postmodern now. I'm not so sure. We still rely on a lot of the same industrial materials that we have for the last 130 years or so. But we tend to not get them as much from the first world. We tend to get them more from the second world or third world, places like China that are less risk averse and more willing to take on heavy pollution burdens that the more risk averse sort of developed world, countries like the US, don't want to take on anymore.
Right. Yeah. And that's kind of where, what I had in mind and was reflecting upon as you were speaking, right, is because like mining practices have changed, of course, over the centuries, right, and even within the last, say, 150 years, right. I think you mentioned that there was this transition from sort of placer mining, right, like the images of people with gold pans out in the creek, right, kind of sifting through and allowing the sort of heavier metals to kind of settle out to the bottom, right, and then it sort of transitioned into like this, I don't know what the technical term is for, but it's more like hard rock mining, like boring into a particular lode and physically extracting ore and then smelting and refining that down into ingots. But so has mining sort of progressed beyond that? It sounds like from what you're saying that mining continues to be environmentally hazardous and continues to potentially be hazardous to the health not only of miners but people impacted, in the water systems, in the air that we breathe, right? So is that kind of environmental risk kind of still taking place? It sounds like it is. It's just been kind of like displaced, right, onto these other portions of the globe. So I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit. Like, where is the majority of the Earth's, silver, lead, zinc, all of those really fascinating and really important metals that you talk about in your book and which you alluded to here in the presentation? Where are they all coming from? Because it's like the world didn't just move past the need for those, right? I mean, those are raw materials that are really basic to the global economy. So yeah, I was just curious as to your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, there is still, silver mining, or at least, as of 5 years ago, there was still silver mining going on in the Silver Valley. The Lucky Friday mine was open, and it's incredibly deep. It's something like 8,000 feet deep.
Oh, wow!
And still very dangerous. I mean, people still die mining in the Silver Valley. But a lot of the dirtier mining and smelting, and particularly I'm thinking about smelting, seems to have moved to countries that are less risk averse than the
Okay.
United States, and let's say England and West Germany or Germany. And so, for instance, in China in the early 2000s and also within the last decade has had a real problems with lead intoxication
Mm-hmm.
from lead smelting, very similar to what we saw in the Kellogg area in the late 19th and 20th centuries.
Yeah, it's so interesting because you'd like to think, right, with, that this is in the past, that it's ancient history, right? But, according to what you're saying here, it sounds like we're still engaging in these practices and they're still destructive and they're still a harm and a hazard to human health. They're just taking place elsewhere, right? Which is really interesting because it brings up a lot of questions about, like the term of like neo-colonialism, right? And the sort of exploitation of the first world, of the third world, I should say, by the first world, right? So there's a lot that we could potentially unpack there, but I want to get to a couple of our audience questions.
Absolutely.
So we have a couple of some comments really and a question really that's kind of more of like a clarification question, but it's interesting because I had the same question when we met and chatted the other day. And so this person asked, when you say the Coeur d'Alenes, are you referring to the official mapped mining district? How was that name chosen for the district?
Yeah, I'm just really using it the way it was used in the late 19th century when
Okay.
and early 20th century when this area was called the Coeur d'Alenes. That's just what it was called for a long time, and it seems kind of natural. It both it mostly referred to the mining district,
Okay.
but it referred, I think, also more generally to the area.
Right.
And so the Silver Valley, which is what the area is now known as, that term didn't really come into common use until the 1970s, 1980s.
Right. Yeah. And just a couple of comments are coming in here. One says we still have active silver and lead mining in the Silver Valley.
Yes.
And, if I could kind of turn that into a question, do you think that that's commonly known? So folks who don't live in Coeur d'Alene or in the broader Coeur d'Alene region, like, would that be shocking to most people? Do you think that lead and silver mining is still taking place? Like, I was shocked. I was blown away when I read your book and I found out that more silver has come from northern Idaho than anywhere on earth. I mean, that was incredible to me, right? Because I think you allude to this in your book as well. I mean, that's, surpassing Potosi in Bolivia, right? The mines like Zacatecas in Mexico, and that's what we hear about when we hear about silver mining historically, but much more, significantly more was taken out of northern Idaho here. So it's incredible.
Yeah, it really is. It really is a remarkable district. The Sunshine Mine is the biggest producing silver mine in American history as well.
Wow. Incredible.
That's a mine. That's a mine in the district.
Yeah. And that was just, it was so revelatory and eye-opening because I wasn't aware of that before, right? And I think that, a lot of folks are probably in the same boat that, all of this mining and extraction was taking place. And it really took place in a short period of time too, in about 100 years, right? Which is really incredible.
Absolutely. And the smelter, the lead smelter was only open for 65 years.
Yeah, and look at the damage that it wrought in that time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to just be conscious of time here. Sorry.
I think most people don't realize that the Silver Valley still produces silver.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so we are at time, but I do want, so if folks need to tune out, please feel free to go ahead and disconnect. I want to thank you for your participation, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask this one final question. So, the theme of the Fettuccine Forum for this year is climate change in Idaho and the West, right? And your book opened up all kinds of doors for me as to environmental degradation and destruction as a result of mining, right? And as we just learned, that's still taking place today, right? So I want to sort of try to tie that into the theme if we can. Like, is mining and environmental degradation sort of linked to climate change? Is there any connection there?
Well, I'm gonna take a page from my colleague at MSU, Tim LeCain, who writes a lot about materiality. And basically what he's saying is that materials have a much more control over us and the environment than we may like to admit. So for instance, lead, if they hadn't been mining and smelting lead in the Silver Valley, things would have been a lot less toxic.
Yeah, right.
The fact that it was lead matters a lot.
Right.
And I would say for climate change, the fact that it's petroleum, that's a material, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's releasing all this CO2 when we burn it, and coal, right? So there's a materiality to the petroleum and the coal. When we burn them, we create anthropogenic climate change, right?
Interesting.
But if we were doing something else with another material, it might not be so bad.
Right.
So I think we should think about the materials that we're using. And also, these are human choices to mine lead and smelt lead, or to drive a big SUV or burn coal or whatever. So in that sense, these are all human choices that affect the environment.
Yeah. There's so many connections and parallels to last month we had the Fettuccine Forum with Jen Pierce, who's a professor in the geosciences department at Boise State University. And I just see so many parallels, and I have a million more questions to ask because I see so much overlap between the two presentations. But we are over time, so I want to be respectful of people's time. Thank you so much, Dr. Snow. Thank you all for participating. I want to just direct people's attention to next month's forum, which will be taking place on April the 7th, and it will feature Professor Sarah Dant, who is chair of the history department at Weber State University, and she'll be giving a talk entitled "The View from the Top: Climate Change in the West and the World." And to register, please visit boiseartsandhistory.org to register for that, and we hope to see you then. Thank you again, Dr. Snow. Thank you so much, Lavona, and thank you all for joining us. Good night.
Travis, thanks everybody.